Good afternoon, Judge Moore and Judge Wang. I'm Jaimie Lynn Kulikowski, former Airborne Army captain and soon-to-be Congresswoman for Colorado's 6th District. Today, I'm filing a motion to increase my request for relief against Governor Jared Polis, because after analyzing death statistics for the state of Colorado over the last 6 years, I have concluded that Governor Jared Polis has caused 75% of our excess deaths this year. So he is not only holding an unlawful monopoly over our right to pursue the American dream through anti-competitive and exclusionary practices, he is causing 75% of our excess deaths with his alarmist, doom and gloom leadership that is holding an unlawful monopoly over his population. I have a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to share with you at this time. Several times throughout this year, we've heard President Trump say, the cure cannot be worse than the problem itself. The solutions and mandates that Governor Jared Polis has gripped our state with is causing a worse problem than the virus itself. My presentation is going to prove this with data from Colorado's Department of Public Health. I don't go into the raw Excel files in my presentation. However, I have the files. I've been working with an employee at the Colorado Department of Public Health to get and gather their open data files. So if anybody needs to check the work I've done, my mathematical analysis, I'm open to showing my work. Further, I have almost 11 years of big data analysis, so I'm used to living in an Excel file with lots of numbers, lots of information, and being able to draw the story out of the data. That's what I'm going to do in my presentation, is tell you the story of the data. Prior to COVID, Colorado's 5-year average death rate increase was 2.5%. I arrived at that number by looking at all the raw number of deaths from 2015 to 2020 in Colorado, and then I looked at the percent increases year over year and then averaged it out from 2015 to 2019 and arrived at an average death rate increase of 2.5%. 2020 has seen an almost 14% increase in deaths from Q1, Q3 2020 compared to a 2% increase in deaths from Q1, Q3 2019. Now, if 2020 had been a normal year and we weren't hit with the bioweapon from China, Colorado could have expected to see about 2.5% more deaths from the first 3 quarters this year than we saw in the first 3 quarters last year. Taking the total numbers, the raw numbers, that means we could have seen approximately 731 more deaths in the first 3 quarters this year than we saw in the first 3 quarters last year. Now, this year has not been normal. We were hit with a bioweapon from China and then thrust into 2 endless wars against invisible enemies, COVID and racism. Because we've been forced into these endless wars, we've seen 4,019 more deaths in the first 3 quarters of this year than we saw in the first 3 quarters last year. Since we have a death rate increase average, if we take away what we could have already expected in terms of increase, so if we take away 731 from the 4,019, we're left with excess deaths of 3,288 in the first 3 quarters of this year. We've lost over 3,000 lives in the first 3 quarters of this year because we've been thrown into endless warring against COVID and racism. Almost half of the excess deaths were caused by something other than COVID. Now let's look at what caused the other deaths, and I'm going to explain how I arrived at these leading causes of death. So Colorado Department of Public Health tracks 30 leading causes of death every year, year over year. What I did was I looked at all that data from 2015 to 2020. I looked at the total number of deaths and the leading causes of death. What I looked for this year were the trend busters, the causes of death that busted their trends, meaning if from 2015 through 2020, a disease was slightly trending up, I didn't pay much attention to it because that's just kind of its trend. It's normal trend. It's doing what it would normally do this year with or without COVID. That's kind of what I'm looking at. If a disease was doing, a little bit better or a little bit worse and kind of on the same trend trajectory, then that means those deaths, it was no different, COVID or no COVID. I looked for the trend busters, and to find this story, I established some criteria. My criteria was if from 2019 to 2020, the cause of death jumped up by 15 percentage points or more, I flagged it. And then on top of that, I looked at this 2-year comparison, so 2019 to 2020, and then I looked at the prior 2-year comparison, 2018 to 2019. Now, if this 2-year comparison jumped up 10 percentage points or more from the prior 2-year comparison, I flagged it. So that was my criteria to draw the trend busters out. I'm going to say it again. If the cause of death increased by 15 percentage points or more from last year to this year, and if this 2-year comparison jumped up 10 percentage points or more from the prior 2-year comparison, 2018 to 2019. These were the 6 trend busters: drug overdoses, homicide, other unspecified infectious diseases, hepatitis, intestinal infections, and then death not yet determined. Drug overdoses surged, a 35% increase between last year and this year. From 2018 to 2019, we almost saw no increases in drug overdoses, in deaths. From 2017 to 2018, we were actually starting to trend down slightly. So we saw less deaths due to drug overdoses from 2017 to 2018. We were starting to trend better. So this was a trend buster. We surged this year in drug overdoses. Same thing with homicides. Homicides jumped up 34% from last year to this year. From 2018 to 19, we actually had 11% fewer homicides in 2019 than we had in 2018. So again, we were starting to trend down. We were doing better. So this 2-year comparison compared to the prior 2-year comparison jumped up 50%. That's huge. Infectious diseases went up 35%. Hepatitis went up 16%. Intestinal infections went up almost 30%. Cause of death not yet determined went up 22%. And in the prior 2-year comparison, these jumped up as well. So these causes of death busted their trends, which means that how we've handled COVID correlates to these deaths. And endless wars, the endless war against COVID, the endless war against racism, the riots we've had have caused these excess deaths. And these are preventable. These we can work on. When leaders sound the alarm, when they create panic and they project a crisis onto their population, telling everyone that we're either going to die or be hospitalized or cause the death or hospitalizations of others if we don't wear masks, stay at home, socially isolate, socially distance, lockdown, shut down, live a virtual reality. If we don't do all this, we're going to die or be hospitalized, or we're going to cause the death or hospitalization of others. Telling your population this is traumatic. Any mental health professional will tell you this. Now, none of them are speaking up right now, and hardly any leader is speaking up right now because nobody wants to take responsibility for what's happening. I am stepping up to be a leader. I am taking responsibility, and I am making sure that Governor Jared Polis gets out of his seat, because his alarmist crisis projection of doom and gloom on his population has caused almost half of our excess deaths. Now, we got hit with the bioweapon from China. There wasn't much we can do about it. We did the best we could in the spring. And we now know so much more now about this virus than we did earlier in the year. But Governor Polis is continuing to sound the alarm by telling everyone in the papers that cases are spiking, everything is surging, everyone's going to get hospitalized. However, when you look at the data, it says otherwise. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But before I leave this slide, I want to reiterate how the crisis projection that our Democratic leaders are throwing onto everyone is traumatic. And a mental health professional, any mental health professional will tell you that trauma sends people back into addictions. It sends us back into our addictive patterns when we've been traumatized and hurt before. So drugs, violence, sex, food. This directly correlates to our spike in drug overdoses, homicides, intestinal infections, hepatitis. Unknown. Probably more accidents are happening. People are having accidental deaths. Because when you throw people into fight or flight, and not just fleeting, this has been going on for almost a year straight of being sent into fight or flight, fear, panic for your life or other people's lives. It packs in trauma, and trauma sends us to addictions. Governor Polis can do something about this. He can quit crying crisis, because we've got a president in his 70s who we saw just have this disease, and we saw his younger son have it. The president was good to go in a few days after some therapies. His younger son was good to go after a couple days with no therapies. I think I had this back when it first came out in late February, early March. I woke up one morning and just felt awful, and was like, oh my God, what did I get hit with? And I concocted an immune boosting drink, drank it straight for 2 days, and I felt better by the end of the second day. We know this by now, that people with strong immune systems and healthy bodies recover fast, just like every other flu-like illness we've ever had in the history of this country. We've now proven this, and so Governor Polis needs to stop with his alarmism and unlawful monopoly on his state. At this point, I want to go into the Colorado Department of Public Health site for just a second. And show you the numbers that Jared Polis is sounding the alarm over. So he's screaming into the papers that numbers are surging, cases are surging, hospitals are they're going to be over capacity, we're going to go into crisis again. However, our death rate has dropped by 80 to 85% between spring and now. We can look at our highest week in April, we had 233 deaths. This would have correlated to hospitals, ICUs, all of that. Our highest week in the past month since flu season started was back in September. We had 42 deaths. That's about 80% drop, an 80% drop from spring to fall. Governor Polis is not reporting this to his people, and he needs to be. We need hope now more than ever. We need to connect with each other now more than ever. We need God now more than ever. But he continues to throw a crisis on us when the numbers speak for themselves. This is not okay. And he's going to end up causing more drug overdoses, more homicides, more intestinal infections. He's going to cause more people to keep going back to addictions and dying. This cannot continue. In closing, the bottom line of my presentation is Colorado's current cure is worse than the problem itself. Jared Polis is directly to blame for our excess deaths of drug overdoses, homicides, intestinal infections, unknown, hepatitis. This is not leadership. What Governor Jared Polis is doing is not leadership, and it's not American. It's unlawfully monopolistic, anti-competitive, and exclusionary. And it's not only prohibiting well people from pursuing their American dream, but it is causing excess deaths that we don't need to keep seeing. So today I move to impeach Governor Jared Polis and put a governor in his place who will open us back up to total normalcy. Judge Moore and Judge Wang, I thank you for your time. Have a great day.